What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a discussion video focusing on, of course, bugs and glitches and how I deal with them as a games reviewer, because as is and will honestly to some degree always be the case, dealing with bugs is simply part of playing games, because even the best optimized and well-performing games still have bugs that people are going to deal with, and just because you don't see them doesn't mean they're not there. Realistically, I doubt that needs much of an explanation, because reality is it's something many people have dealt with, and the story of someone having bought a game only to be burned by poor performance is hardly anything new. I mean, just the recent release of Monster Hunter Wilds, for instance, has been plagued by technical problems, even if it's a fun game underneath. The reason I thought this might make for an interesting sort of conversation is simply because, on one hand, my tolerance for bugs is way higher than your average person's because I am trying to review a game, so any problem I experience is just something I'm going to note in the review itself. Like, if I dealt with a whole bunch of crashing, that's obviously something to talk about. Now, I will say that is something of a slightly acquired skill on my part. If you watch a lot of my early reviews when I was first getting into reviewing things at all, it's not something I really sort of mentioned much, and then I sort of over time kind of learned what to look for and what to include, how to present it, that kind of thing. And it's always something I'm trying to at least iterate on in some fashion, because quite frankly, it's rare that the story is simply, is it good or is it bad? There's usually a lot of nuance involved, which I think is why a channel like Digital Foundry does so well, because they have the time, equipment, and the skill to break all of that stuff down and talk about it specifically. Whereas somebody like myself dealing with a singular set of hardware can really only relay my own experience about it. But getting down to the sort of foundation of the issue, while games can be these incredibly immersive and interactive experiences that people often equate to art, reality is they're also products and people expect things to work when they buy them. Now, as with basically any product, there's also a certain minimum that people will accept in terms of what does and doesn't bother them, and that's going to vary person to person. And despite reports of me being an elaborate AI designed to review video games, I am in fact a person. So it might be best to start with my own thoughts and opinions about bugs. So I want to cover this before I go into specifically how I look at them for reviews, which I do have a sort of system, believe it or not, or I guess categories maybe might be the better word. And on a personal level, my tolerance for these things is very high. I've always been very into computers, I've always played on PC, and so when I encounter things like bugs and stuff, it's an opportunity to do things like troubleshoot, which has always been part of just dealing with PCs. So if a game is crashing, I like to investigate why, and there's usually workarounds or fixes, that kind of thing. But even then, obviously your average person doesn't want to do that. But because I know how and am comfortable doing those things, having problems doesn't tend to bother me that much. Which means the only time like significant bugs tend to get under my skin is when it's like a consistent interruption with no like discernible long-term fix. That is to say, games that keep crashing every few minutes, games with bugs that frequently break the game or prevent progression, requiring frequent reloads. That happens sometimes. And that sort of vein tends to be the most serious stuff. And that kind of thing is usually where I draw the line with like my own personal patience. But if I'm just having trouble with a game crashing on startup or, just black screening at a specific moment and I can sort of investigate that and find a way around it on my own, to me, that's just not really a big deal. It's just kind of part of my job, if anything. Like, obviously, I'll mention that in the reviews, of course, but that's pretty much where it ends, for me at least. Now, I kind of wanted to talk about some of the categories and the way I sort of notate bugs and the like. So it's important to mention right here, if it hasn't already been obvious throughout the video, that I'm a PC channel, which makes problems that occur like specifically on other platforms not really my problem, frankly. But when it comes to time to actually make the review itself, I will have, while playing through the game, notated any sort of problems I've had on a technical level. That is to say, crashes, stuttering, FPS problems, memory leaks, that kind of thing. And I mention a few of those specifically because some of that is engine specific. For instance, a lot of Unity games can have a memory leak. It doesn't always happen, but in my experience with games made in Unity, it's not uncommon when playing those games for significant periods of time, like 4 or 5 hours even, for the game to suddenly have some sort of issue and cause it to get like absolutely terrible frame rates until you quit that program and then restart it. Whereas the stuttering issue with Unreal games is extremely well documented and likely needs no kind of introduction if you're watching a video like this, but things like that just give me a sort of baseline of things to look for. Now, outside of just strictly how a game is running, you also have to keep in mind how the actual actual game is performing behind the scenes, so to speak, in terms of how it's handling its own continuity. That is to say, are you dealing with game-breaking bugs? Are there sequence breaks, which tends to be a big thing with RPGs? Sometimes you'll make choices and then the game either sort of doesn't reflect those or represent those, or some particular order in which you did a particular set of quests actually breaks something because the interaction wasn't anticipated, and then now the game is uncompletable. And just other various forms and ways of soft-locking you. Or in some cases, more permanently, depending on how the save system for that game works. All of those are sort of factors that I look for and have to keep in mind. But generally, I divide them into 3 categories, which are basically minor, medium, and major. Minor stuff is pretty self-explanatory. This is things like clipping, visual stuff, like sometimes the physics on a particular bit of clothing gets messed up and it makes it look all weird. And it's like, yeah, it's kind of annoying, but it's not really gonna cause you much of an issue. So basically, anything in that category are bugs that you can see and notice and acknowledge while simultaneously realizing they don't really impact the gameplay much at all and are simply, at most, a minor nuisance. And then there's stuff that's more kind of on the medium level. These are things that they cause a gameplay disruption in some form or fashion. That is to say that you have to reload, you have to specifically work around it in some way that might cause you some issues. Now, this category can be a little rough, frankly, because it is often a very subjective thing, because what is slightly annoying to me and what is a more prominent problem to someone else are obviously going to be different, and as a result of that, that's why it's important to notate just everything you experience. But for me, this tends to be like if you do something a particular way, it causes a problem. I think a decent example here is that sometimes certain games, when fighting enemies, they'll just start, say, T-posing, or they'll stand completely still, and something about what they're supposed to be doing breaks, and it kind of ruins the fight as a result. Or in more extreme cases of problems like that, for some reason, an enemy might become unkillable in certain instances. If you, say, did a certain type of damage or tried to kill that particular enemy in a specific way, I've seen things like that happen, and it's an annoyance. You're probably going to have to reload to fix it, but usually it is fixable without a significant disruption to the overall game. But, some people might have that happen on, say, like a major fight, and then to them, that's going to be a really big deal. So like I said, there's some subjectivity on that particular level, but then there's the major stuff. This is typically the things people like to talk about. The game consistently crashing, game-breaking bugs, constantly getting soft lock, stuff like that. These are usually what people will consider when they are calling a game unplayable. Even if it's not literally unplayable, you'll often see that word thrown around in these cases. And that's stuff like persistent, frequent crashes. Like, for instance, when Star Wars Jedi Survivor launched. Content-wise, I really enjoyed that game, but outside of consistently crashing over the entire period that I played it, there was also a specific sequence that would crash the game almost every time until I found a specific series of hardware settings that got the game to run just long enough for me to get past that area before it went back to crashing once every other hour. Another game that springs to mind for this actually is a older title, and that is The Waylanders, a game I took a look at some time ago, and that game is an absolute mess. Crashes, FPS drops, frequent problems, and while technically it's possible to beat the game if you do it in just the right order, a significant amount of the back half of the game is just completely busted. You'll constantly run into game-breaking bugs forcing you to reload, and some quests just straight up aren't completable as a result of that. And when you throw all that together, that tends to be what I'm looking at and how I approach these things while reviewing stuff. Now, as I mentioned a little bit earlier though, the biggest thing I've found is to really just report everything you experience on that front. Even if it's minor, if it's barely an inconvenience, just anything like that, just let people know. And that is especially true for reviewing games that haven't actually released yet. It's no secret that sometimes this channel, in fact, does get access to games ahead of time via review keys and stuff, and one of the most important things people are looking for when they're looking into buying a game on the release day is how is it running from a review, which I think is fair, because regardless of whether or not a game is fantastic or a marvel in some other sense, if it does not run well for the majority of people, it's a bit of a non-starter. But I did say the majority of people just in that sentence, though, and that's kind of where it gets tricky. So the thing about reviewing a game ahead of its release is that I really only have my own sort of experiences to go on, and it's very possible for a game to run perfectly fine for me, only for it to run terribly for somebody else. That happens all the time. Now, speaking for the case of things like PC though, as I mentioned, I'm very comfortable troubleshooting and fixing issues, so something like a simple driver problem that I could fix relatively easy that isn't really any fault of the game's might result in an absolutely terrible experience for somebody else. But even just discounting genuine user error, which does happen in and of itself, it's also just possible that different specs and hardware, especially on PC, can cause unexpected issues, like say an exact configuration might cause some specific problem on that person's set of hardware that's unique to them, whereas I don't experience it at all, which is usually why I try to mention that in some form when I review games ahead of release. Now, to sort of bring this video to a close, I figured I'd mention something that I would say is in many ways sort of common knowledge, if anything, just common sense kind of, and that is that playing a game way after its release with all of its updates and any potential DLC typically bundled in a single package is usually the best way to experience a title, because you don't generally have to deal with these issues as much, and if you do, the answer has usually been found and posted somewhere. And even as somebody who reviews games, and reviews a lot of older games as a matter of fact, that tends to make it easier to just review older games because all of those potential problems and pitfalls have been fixed and sorted out, and I can just do a little bit of research and sort out any potential issue with much less of an issue. So yes, especially for just the average person, that will simply always be the most effective way of avoiding issues. And considering that there are more games than any one person could ever play in their entire lifetime, there's really nothing wrong with that. If anything, I think it gives people the opportunity to discover games that might have passed them by and also play them in their best state for cheaper and potentially discover something that they really connect with. I know I've had that experience many times, and I imagine others have as well. But while that is always going to be true, it also doesn't really change the fact that many people want to play things as soon as they are available, especially if it's something they're particularly excited for, be that the continuation of a story, a persistent gameplay loop that they enjoy, or just an opportunity for some good old escapism. But in all of those events, what I try to do on my end basically is simply take note of absolutely every kind of problem I experience while playing a game, categorize them into, how or why they might be important, which is obvious for some things, less so for others, and then of course simply report on that stuff in the review itself, while also noting that this is what I experienced, and as tends to be the case, you might run into a particular set of circumstances that cause some other issue, which is a particular instance in which I think Steam user reviews really shine, because being able to get a general sentiment of how the game is running across a sort of wide section of people playing it with all sorts of different hardware is obviously always going to be more effective than typically any amount of QA depending on the size of the player base, but also a significantly wider net than even reviewers could cast with their own hardware and platforms and stuff. So all of that said, like everybody else as a games reviewer, I have to deal with bugs, but how I look at them and how I deal with them does tend to be a bit different than other people. But ultimately, there are always going to be bugs in video games. That's just the nature of how they're made and how software works. But I think if you take some time to learn not only about frequent common issues with certain engine types or certain types of games even, you tend to notice recurring patterns and start to learn what to look for, especially when, say you're watching a review because you want to buy something. I think if you know what to look for and can look across multiple reviews, you can start to aggregate those things, and before even getting your hands on a game, you might start to understand the problems a certain person was facing. And then you can decide for yourself whether or not that's something you would or would not be willing to deal with. But all of that said, I think that's just about everything I've got to say on this particular matter, so hopefully you found some amount of that interesting, as most of the time these videos tend to just be me rambling and sort of organizing my own thoughts on a particular subject, but some people seem to enjoy them, so I still make them on occasion. If you enjoyed any of that, or if you're looking for game reviews, I suppose, by all means stick around, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz, but regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.